Super duper. Well, good evening and welcome to tonight's session. Tonight we are doing criteria, what to reward and when. And as usual, thank you very much for joining me. I love seeing everybody who comes along each week. It's very nice. I'm going to drop the introduction now because I think we've all got it, haven't we? It was for the new people, but I think we're there. So today we're jumping into criteria, like I say, what to reward and when. It's figuring out what behavior we're looking at rewarding and what to do when we're not maybe being as successful as we were hoping that we were going to be. So as usual, it's going to be quite informative. No science experiments today, very unusually, no science experiments from me, but lots of information still. So I'm going to do my talking and we'll do the same as we did last session, which worked really, really well. Thank you. Asking questions in the comments box. So feel free, fire away as you think of something, pop it in the comments box at the bottom and Lauren can ask us the questions then at the end when we get there and I can hopefully give some form of a sensible answer back. So we shall get going. So tonight, the context, what is criteria in training, right? That's the first thing. Let's define what we mean by criteria in training. So in the context of dog training, criteria refers to the specific standards that you establish for your dog in order to meet to receive reinforcement. So essentially, it's whatever you decide that your dog needs to do in order to receive their reinforcement. We did reinforcement previously in operant conditioning. And so we as positive reinforcement trainers say, when this behavior is performed, I'm saying you've reached my criteria. Here is your reinforcement for doing that. So it's essentially the behaviors or actions that you want your dog to exhibit. And when they do, you're going to mark a reward. You're going to hear me saying mark and reward quite a lot throughout this session. And what I mean by that is when the dog performs the behavior, you mark it, you say, yes, good, nice, whatever word it is that we choose to use, or perhaps you use a clicker. You're basically saying that thing there, I liked it. That was the criteria. Yes, good, nice, well done. You give them a marker and they know that following that, you're about to reach in your treat pouch and come out with a reinforcer for them. Remember, a reinforcer is something that sees behavior drive up there. So setting clear criteria in training is absolutely crucial. So sorry, I've lost myself already. It's absolutely crucial to set clear criteria. If you're not clear about what you're asking your dog to do, they're never going to be able to do it. Your training will always feel fuzzy and muddy, and you're going to struggle to keep it momentum going, and you're going to struggle to see great success because if they can't hit criteria that you aren't clear about, it's really unfair on them. So we're going to look at, during our session today, we're going to look at criteria in two very distinct places because I think it makes it really easy for us to imagine ourselves in those situations and to kind of understand it really well. So one of them is out on walks, right? And the other one is in a formal training session. And they're two clear places that we see ourselves with our dogs, and I think we can kind of envisage very well. It is worth noting, though, that we can have criteria for our dogs in any environment that we exist in them with. So at home, in the car, visiting friends, going to the vets, we can have criteria for behavior that we want to see in literally all of these things. So it does extrapolate out very much so, but I'm going to use those two clear-cut examples just because I think we can all go, yeah, I get it. Very easy there. So looking at walks, to be fair, it's really rare that people think about what they want their dog to do before they go out on a walk. And when you go on a half an hour walk, your dog offers quite literally thousands of behaviors when you're out on that walk, right? And every time they perform a behavior, operant conditioning is working away. We heard about this last week, and it's providing consequences to that behavior that they've just performed. And if a dog likes that consequence, they're going to do more of that behavior. If the dog didn't like the consequence, they're going to do less of that behavior. So the dog is always learning. And if we don't have our own criteria to reinforce, we're leaving behavior change to chance, essentially. And I can tell you right now that the environment is a really great place to provide reinforcement. It's really good at providing reinforcement for dogs. So if we don't have our own criteria to reward, what we see is the dog becomes less focused on us, less engaged with us, less interested with us, and they become more focused on their environment, which then leads to walks becoming increasingly difficult, and I would argue unsafe too, because the more they're involved with their environment, the less they're involved with us, the more they're going to go away from us, and the less able they are to hear hear us when we're asking them to perform behaviours. So I'd like to encourage you to be quite mindful and have behavioural criteria that you would like to reinforce, kind of set up in your mind when you go out for a walk together. I do believe there is space and time for decompression walks. So I don't think we need to have this all the time. I don't think we need to be seeing progression and working every single walk that we have. But I do think that most walks that we go on, if we're going out to walk the dog and it's not a clearly defined decompression walk, we probably should have in our heads an idea of what we're looking for and what we're going to mark and reward and what we want to see improving or increasing, and we want to support our dog in learning. So that means if you've got it in your head, you're setting your dog up for success and you're continually developing and progressing their skills, and you get to reap the rewards of a really engaged session as well, which is great. In training sessions, we tend to be pretty good at having criteria because we've gone to train the dog. So we know what we want the dog to do as well. We've got it in our heads, what we want them to achieve, what we want to get out of this training session. Maybe it's a new trick or a new skill that we're trying to teach them, right? The problem with these sessions, though, is when the dog doesn't do what we were expecting them to do. And I see this very much so in people who are beginning their training journey. They think that their dog can do something quite advanced, and it's just because they haven't got that level of experience and they don't really know about the kind of lower levels of stuff. That's fine. But I also see it with really advanced students as well. And what I most commonly see with advanced students is they think their dog can do something here because they've seen it done in another place, in another environment, and they're unable to bring themselves down to where that dog needs them to be. So we're going to look at that as well, because that's quite common for our advanced students to struggle with adapting what they're asking for, that criteria, when the dog isn't able to perform. So there we go. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the main issues that I see with criteria, because I think it's probably easier to kind of highlight the issues and explain how I would come about and come over those than it would be to kind of lay it out in any other manner. So this is what I've done. So the first issue I want to look at is not knowing what to look for, right? So if you don't know what to look for, you don't know what or when to reward, right? And this is quite common. Like, you say to me, I'm going out on a walk. Well, what are my criteria? What do I want that to be, right? And it's a really easy, simple fix. This not knowing something is really simple. We just sit and we do some planning, essentially. So here we're thinking, we're going out on a walk. My best suggestion for this, to create criteria for your walk, is to think about what you do want to see. Most people, when we talk to them, think about what they don't want to see. But when we look at operant condition that we did last week, what we want to do is reinforce the criteria that we do want to see, that we want to see an increase of. It's much more helpful for the dog and it is active towards their progression, right? So there's not much point in looking at what we don't want the dog to do. So things like, I don't want them to bark, I don't want them to pull, I don't want them to run away from me. They're not helpful things to be looking at. What I want to do is flip that on its head and look at what I do want to increase. So really simply, perhaps instead of barking, your criteria for reinforcement is to look at you, look up at me. Okay. Instead of pulling, my criteria for reinforcement might be hanging around by my right leg. And that's really specific. I'm really clear with my criteria, hanging around by my right leg, not just not pulling on the lead. That's really loose. I want the dog to actively meet my criteria, which is hanging around by my right leg. And perhaps instead of running away from you, if that's the thing that you don't want, perhaps your criteria is turning and offering a check-in, which to me means to turn and look at me very frequently throughout the walk, because the more they're turning and looking at me, the less running away that they're going to do. It's what we call a mutually exclusive behavior. You can't run away and look at me at the same time. Okay. They're much more helpful things and they're much clearer things. And the lovely thing is that they're all things that we can see as humans too, right? And you know me, I'm really giddy and really excited about things. It activates what's called our reticular activating system. And this is the part of our brain that's really responsible for finding stuff and proving ourselves to ourselves, right? So if you're thinking, I might be buying a blue car, suddenly you see blue cars everywhere. We've all heard that analogy. It's really commonly used. And that's our reticular activating system. If we program it for our dogs, I'm looking for my dog to look at me, our brain finds all of those moments for us. So we see it more often, we reinforce it more often, and then what we get is then that lovely successful increase in that behavior. And so we're actually seeing the results of that really nicely. For me, success here comes in the form of the dog doing it a bit too much. So you're kind of going, right, I'm tripping over my dog now. Like, they won't stop looking at me. It's really intense now. Okay. That to me, that says you've done an awesome job of being really clear about the criteria that gets that dog reinforced, because they are absolutely demonstrating that they know exactly what you want them to do and they really like offering it. So that clarity is really useful. Figure out what you do want them to have. Just sit and think about it before you go on your walk. Be very clear what you're looking for, and then your brain will help you do it as well. So that's the first thing that I would say. Simply start planning what criteria you want to reward. Second issue, really common. What if you never see the behavior that you want to reinforce? We touched on this, didn't we, before? What if you just don't see it? Okay. You want to reinforce a behavior, but you don't ever see it. So the truth is, that can happen for quite a number of reasons. And definitely when I stand with clients, it's a lot easier really to look at the dog and point and say, oh, I didn't do that because of this, right? But we're looking at the overarching principles here. So one reason that they might not be able to do it is that they've literally never been asked to do that behavior before. And that's really common. Like, we start saying, actually, Rach, I really like your idea of the dog turning and looking at me, but that's something that we've never actively asked the dog to do before. Well, how on earth are they supposed to know that all of a sudden that's what you want them to do? It's not a simple, you can't just say to them, hey, do you know what? If you stand and look at me, I'll reward you. They don't speak human, they don't speak English. We need to help them out there. So they don't know what you want to do. We need to help them. We'll use the example of the dog checking in with us. The first thing that I want to do then, if I think my dog doesn't know this and my dog's going to struggle to do this, the first thing I want to do is really reduce my criteria as much as possible. And what that means is I want to make it as easy as possible for my dog to get a yes and to get that reinforcement. What I'm looking for here is lots of wins for that dog. So I might start by asking for something easier than my end goal, and then work up to that. So, for example, with looking at me, I might actually mark and reward an approximation of that. And an approximation is a really nice word to use when we're starting out here, because it means that they don't have to get it all the way right. They just have to do something sort of right. So an approximation of a turn and check-in would be the dog turning its head in my general direction. And that's something that I really, really commonly offer for dogs. So when I'm taking out a new dog and it doesn't have that behavior, it doesn't know how to turn around and check in with me, what I'll do is anytime it turns its head in my general direction, I'll go, yes, good. And I make sure that my word is blooming loud and blooming exciting. So I get their attention. They finish off that last little bit going, the blooming heck are you doing, love? I help them out with that. That's it. And I might chuck the treat at them to make sure that they're getting it, but I'm not asking for that full. If I wait for that full head turn, it's simply not coming. It's too high a criteria. So I reduce my criteria and I say, just turning and looking in my general direction, that's enough for me. Once I'm comfortable that they're doing that, and we'll talk about how to decide at what level that I'm there and I'm comfortable, right? I might then raise my criteria. So I might go from the dog turning around and generally looking in my direction to the dog looking at my body. Now, I'm very confident that I'm an entire human being. A lot of people will ask for direct eye contact, and that's a really, really narrow criteria. That's really challenging, right? So again, my criteria might not be as loose as just turning and looking at me, but looking at my whole body is still quite a low criteria, isn't it? They've got much more success being able to do that. I will then mark and reward them looking at my legs, looking at my trunk, looking at my head. Hellfire, I'll mark them looking at my treat pouch. If it's attached to me, I'll mark them, reward them for looking at it because it's on my person, okay? So it's all of it, in my opinion, is better than them not looking at me at all. So I'd like to see progress and I'd like to mark approximations and we'll develop it on from there. So the first thing you want to do is lower those criteria as low as you can possibly think to lower them. The other thing I'll look at is how close we are to each other. So distance, along with duration and distractions, they're three huge factors that I can control in my training sessions. So huge, in fact, that we're going to do an entire Zoom session on distance, duration, and distractions because it is really worth doing. But what I'm going to say here, just for the purposes of criteria, is when the dog is closer to me, they're going to find it easier. When the dog is further away from me, they're going to find it harder. So if I'm asking for something new, a new behavior that they might not have been offering very much before, if I get that dog real close to me and asking for it there, they're much more likely to succeed, they're much more likely to win, and we're much more likely to actually meet those criteria. So, for example, with looking at me, I might simply stand still and engage the dog in a game that encourages them to look at me stood still in nice close proximity. So really easy game for that. just the up-down game. So as soon as the dog looks at me, I mark and put the treat on the floor. And when they look at me again, I mark and put the treat back on the floor again. So all they have to do is go donk, 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 donk. And I've basically created a moment in time for us to practice the skill that I'm looking for and to help them develop the ability to do it outside. Hopefully then that will then progress on, right? I'm also going to look at distraction levels. Just said that's one huge thing that we can factor in. Essentially for this, what I'm looking at is, are we close to a distraction? And please remember that close is subjective. What you think is close and what your dog thinks is close can often be very different. It's not about what you think, it's about what they think. If they can't meet your criteria because you're too close to something that they find distracting, which for some dogs might mean a dog on the opposite side of the road, but for other dogs might mean a dog on the opposite side of a football field, you're too close. So removing yourself and getting further away from those distractions is a helpful way to help them re-engage with you and help them do what you're asking them to do, right? Finally, when we're seeing low instances of offered behavior, as in eye contact or turning and checking in with me, and they're offering that on a low amount, please don't let those little amounts slip past you, because there will be moments that they offer it when you didn't necessarily ask for it, but they offered it and they were playing, they were gambling with you, they were chancing it with you, they were wondering if they were going to get that reward, and you didn't reward them. So they actually took that moment and went, doesn't always work then, huh? And it's gone into their memory bank of doesn't always work. So when you're first starting out with a behavior and you're getting low levels of it offered, this is the point at which we really want to challenge ourselves and say, I want to hit 100% of this. You never will. You will never hit 100%. Don't go home beating yourself up about it. But if you go out with the intention of trying to make 100% of those marked and rewarded, then you've got a much better chance of success. So be really mindful. If you're looking for check-ins, mark and reward check-ins wherever you see them. So you might be thinking in your head, when we get to the field, I'll start playing. But actually, they had an approximation a few times over when you were walking on the street, or when you're on that little snicket going up, they might turn and just half do it for you. Mark and reward those, because the more you do it, operant conditioning tells us, the more you're going to see it. So it's really, really worth doing. The other thing, of course, is it keeps programming your brain to keep looking for it, to keep spotting it. And then you become professional at spotting it as well, which really just helps everything go up as well. Perfect. Okay. Third issue, breaking down complex behavior. Now, we've kind of touched on it already with checking in eye contact. If the dog can't do it, I'm going to lower my expectations. I'm going to reduce my criteria. And that's on kind of like a real world example out and about in the world. But what about in a training session, right? So let's say, for example, you're going to teach a new trick, but you're not sure where you want to start. And this is genuinely a hard skill to get right. It's definitely something that you get better with practice. I know for sure, as I've practiced as a trainer and I've stood in front of more people and I've taught more things, that this is a skill that has been bolstered and developed through absolutely using it and trying it and testing, right? But the lovely thing is, your dogs give you immediate feedback on this. You've either got it right and they can do it, or you've got it wrong and they still can't do it. So it's really interesting when you get a complex behavior and you start breaking it down, your dog's going to tell you whether you're on the right track, yes or no. And you just need to use that data. The thing here is to not get yourself emotionally involved in it, because it's really easy to feel like failures when the dog isn't getting it, or to feel frustrated with them for not getting it. But actually, if we take it on its surface level as data and say, did that work, yes or no? Then I can change what I'm doing. Think of yourself a little bit more like a computer. And if we don't take it to heart so much, it's a little bit easier. And it's really helpful to be able to use that data to edit ourselves a little bit. So the way I do this, because of course I've had lots of practice of going to a room of people, what do you want to learn today? And some person in the corner will pull out a mad skill that I've never heard of, never thought of, never even considered training a dog. And they want to do something. I have found that for me, the easiest way to do this is to literally pretend to be the dog. And I know that sounds mad, but if I pretend I'm the dog, all of a sudden I can walk myself through the actions that the dog needs to take. And I can use that to break it down and figure out what I need to do. So all those times in class, guys, that you asked me to do something random and I was literally pretending to be a dog. So what this looks like is, let's take a lovely example of a say your prayers trick. Say your prayers, for those of you who don't know, it means the dog would sit. The dog then needs to lift both of its front paws up. they're going to extend them out and they're going to put them on either my arm that I'm holding out for them like this, or a box or a chair or something in front of them. They're going to reach out, put their hands on it, and then what they're going to do is they're going to bow their head so they look like they're praying. Okay, it's quite a complex skill to teach because there's quite a few things you can imagine. We can't just like lure them into that. It's quite a challenging one to teach. So if I pretend to be the dog and do what I've just done, it's really helpful, because what they have to do first is, right, they have to sit. So my brain goes, okay, they need to be able to sit. That's one of the things that they need to do. It's one of the criteria. Then they need to be able to lift their arms up. That's another criteria. Then they need to be able to put their arms on something else. That's another criteria. Then they need to be able to put their head down. And what I've done then is I've broken it up into its component parts, right? So I can say, once I've got the component parts, can the dog do each component part, right? I've broken it down. I've got lots of different criteria now. Can the dog sit? Yes or no? If the answer's no, well, that's your starting point, isn't it? If the answer's yes, perfect, we've got that. Now what? Can they lift both of their paws up together? Yes or no? If the answer's yes, cool, keep going. If the answer's no, we need to figure out how to get them to do this bit now, don't we? So we might have thought that that was a pretty low criteria, but our dog's telling us, I can't do that. That's too complex for me. You're going to need to break that bit of it down even further for me. So even though I've taken a big skill and broken it down, there might still be components in there that I need to break down further. So if I've now got this and I go, right, they can't do this, how am I going to get them to do this? Just doing it over and over. Well, the first thing is, can they do it with one hand? That's a lower criteria, right? Can they do it with one hand? Yes or no? No. Okay. Can they do a paw? That's a lower criteria than that, isn't it? Can they do paw? Yes or no? And then you can go from there. So you can see that just breaking it down, what's smaller than that? What's smaller than that? I'll often talk to Lauren. We often have this with our complex training clients that we're doing some really big behavior stuff with. And we talk about it as finding the bridge. Like, what's the bridge between them being able to do this and where they are right now? What do those steps look like? So for everybody, it can be totally different. But for me, definitely pretending to be the dog doing it myself is a really helpful thing, because I can feel it and I can really visualize doing it and I can really break it down. So bonus points if you stand in a field doing this over and over again. So yeah, each time take the smallest part and go from there. Your dogs will always tell you whether you've got this right or not. If they can do it, you've got it right. If they still can't do it, you're not low enough yet. You need to break it down even further than that. Okay, next issue, the fourth issue, knowing when to progress, right? We touched on this earlier with the idea of them looking at me in a field. When do I go, you've got that now, now's the next step? And this one is lovely because it makes me feel rich. Okay, how do you know when your dog is ready to go on to the next criteria? The answer is when you'd bet me 20 quid that they do it, right? So when you say to me, Rach, I bet you £20 that they will offer that behavior that I'm asking for, then you're ready to move up, because most of you won't bet 20 quid thinking you're going to lose it. If 20 quid isn't enough of a deal for you, if 20 quid, if you're a gambler and you're quite happy to throw 20 quid away, increase it to 50 or 100, whatever the answer is that makes you go, I'm not sure I'm ready to take that bet yet. Because then when you are ready, I know that you have got to a place where your dog is able to perform that skill. So, Rach, I bet you 20 quid that when I say sit, my dog puts its bum on the floor. Perfect. Okay. I bet you 20 quid that when I stand still, my dog would like to play the up-down game with me. I bet you 20 quid that when I put my right hand out, they offer me their left paw. Yeah. When you're sure that you would win that bet, you can move on to the next criteria. And interestingly, you can do that in a number of ways. So one of the ways is by increasing the distance, the duration, or the distraction. And as we said, that's going to be a separate thing. Or you can change your rate of reinforcement. So at the beginning of teaching something, we reinforce them for every single one, and then we can move them on to a different reinforcement schedule. Again, that one's going to have a whole separate Zoom session attached to it. But essentially, we can make it harder in one of two ways. We can either change the environment for them and what we're asking them to do it in, or we can not reward them as much as we had been doing previously. I would never recommend just stopping, because that, of course, will mean that they've gone and they're in a completely different quadrant here. They're no longer getting the good stuff, and that would actually reduce their behavior that's been offered. So that's not a sensible thing to do. But we can certainly edit how much reinforcement they get. So that would be 20 quid. Fifth problem then. What about when we see behaviour in some places, but not in other places? Really, really common. Like I said, this is something that I often see in advanced people working with their dogs, or certainly people that have been at something for a little while. We might change up the scenery a little bit. We might go to a new place, might go on a new walk, and then they're all like, oh, but they could do it before and now they can't do it now. So what's changed? What's different, right? So it is honestly, it's likely linked to a lot of things, and we're gradually going to cover them in the coming sessions. So like the amount and type of distractions around us, how close they are, how the dog's feeling, how much work they've been doing. We're going to look at peak performance in another session as well. So to keep it short but useful, the best advice I can give is to check with the dog before doing anything, right? So sometimes, what do I mean by that? Sometimes, particularly when we have a teenage dog, we go out for a walk and our dogs are wonderful. They're really engaged. They're really enthusiastic. They're really attentive. They're fantastic. They're really on it. They can do all the things that we're asking for. They're almost gagging for it and want even more, right? Other times, like I say, particularly with teenage dogs, it's a little bit like walking a rock. Like, it's really hard. And you're looking at this dog going, what? There's no brain in this dog that you're trying to do. So I like to assess the dog before I do anything, and before I really decide what my criteria are. I like to assess the dog, and I assess the dog a little bit like a car. It's an analogy I heard somebody else using once, and I really enjoyed it because it made it really kind of like memorable for me. So first thing I want to do, if I'm getting in a new car, what's the first thing I want to check? The brakes, because I ain't going nowhere if I ain't going to be able to stop. And it's the same with the dogs, right? The first thing I want to check is their brakes. So how do I test a dog's brakes? Well, I want to check that they can do stuff with me when we're still. So I'm going to stand still and I'm going to do some stuff with them, right? And if they can engage with me and they can work with me, good, they've passed the brakes test. Next thing I want to check is steering, because if I'm moving, I want to make sure that I can steer this car in a certain direction. How do I test the steering on a dog? Simples. I walk forwards, I walk backwards, I might turn to the left, I might turn to the right, all while engaging with the dog and playing with the dog. Are they able to follow my directional changes? Yes or no? If they pass that test, great. If they naff off into the distance, they clearly haven't passed that test. If they lose their ears and can't engage with me, they've not passed that test, right? The third and final test then, and only when I am sure that my dog has brakes and steering, will I test the gears and the speed. I am not going to start running around a field like a madwoman, getting my dog all giddy and hyped up if they've just shown me that they can't even pay attention to me when I'm stood still. But essentially, testing the gears would be creating arousal up, arousal down. I would get them giddy and I would help them calm back down again. And I want to see how engaged they are with me when they're giddy, right? If your dog has demonstrated that they have attentiveness and engagement at all three of those tests, then that's easy. My criteria are set pretty high for that walk, right? I'm saying to them, I'm expecting decent work out of you. I'm expecting this higher level behavior out of you because you've demonstrated that you can do all these things. So I would set my criteria reasonably high. If my dog failed the brakes test, I'm not going to set high criteria for that walk because they're going to fail. The point of training is success, not failure. So what I want to do is say, right, I've got an idiot dog on my lead today. First of all, they're staying on their lead, because if they can't even stay with me when they're doing the brakes test, I'm not going to trust them off the lead. But I'm going to lower all of my criteria. So I might have, on a really good day, let them run away and looked for criteria, which is, can they check in with me at 100 meters away from them? Really big criteria, right? But today I'm thinking, can they check in with me while they're on their lead? Can they just look at me while they're on their lead? And if they can do that, great, I'm going to mark and reward it. If they can't, I'm going to need to lower my criteria even further and say, can they check in with me when I stand still? Can they just do that? Well, I'm going to fiddle with my criteria. Obviously, mid-ground criteria. Then what you need to do is keep taking the data that your dog is providing you. They either are or are not achieving your criteria. If they are, you can increase your criteria ever so slightly. If they are not, then you need to decrease your criteria and ask for easier things, right? Your goal is always to select the criteria that your dog can achieve. You want to start your walk out with lots of wins. Yes, 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 yes. And then gradually, ideally, progress them and push them on so that they're continuing to develop. You don't want them to fail from the off. If they start failing from the off, they're going to decide, not worth engaging with this, don't want to be doing it, it's not rewarding to me, it's frustrating to me, and you're going to do a number on your relationship as well. Not particularly helpful. So They are the most common issues that I see with criteria, raising, dropping them. And I hope that I've shown you how to kind of think about them slightly differently. If you've got any questions, please do pop them in the box. I don't know if I've seen anything pop up so far, but I'm sure Lauren's been watching it, so I can hand over to Lauren and see if she has any little questions for us.
Hello, I do. So you were talking about rewarding a dog for walking on your right hand side.
Yes.
If your dog isn't offering that, how would you break that behavior down?
Yeah, that's a really good one because it's quite challenging, isn't it? Because we've just randomly decided that we want them to start walking on our right hand side because it's more clear than don't pull. Don't pull is a really loose, difficult thing, but walking on my right hand side is a clear criteria, right? So the first thing that I want to do, and bearing in mind, honestly, every dog is different, so they will all learn differently. So it is worth doing something with the trainer if you are struggling. But one of the things that I would do is I can check, can the dog do this in an easy place when we're stood still? Can I show them what I want in an easy place when we're stood still? I might show them how to hang out with me. I might show them that appearing on my right hand side gets you good stuff. I might start out with some games out there. I might tee it up. Certainly in the house, randomly, they're going to appear at my side every now and again. I might be able to position myself cleverly. So when I open the fridge, they're going to come to my right hand side. I can create opportunities to kind of reward them with that. So I want to start out that process. Then what I can do when I'm out on a walk is I can think carefully about where I'm putting the reward, right? And again, we could do this as another session. But if my dog's somewhere up ahead of me, it's very unlikely that they're ever going to appear at my side, right? Because that would mean that they randomly need to walk backwards. And I only know of one dog that does this, Murphy. He hops backwards to get into position, right? Most dogs, if they're in front of you, won't offer this coming back to you unless you show them how to do it. If, however, I throw a treat behind me and create an environment where my dog is behind me, I know that they're likely to come back past my right hand side here, right? So what I can do is I can throw a treat behind me and then I can catch them. And as they accidentally meet my criteria, they're coming through on my right hand side, I can mark and reward them there. Good. And I can get that treat in. I might choose to pay them into their mouth. Or if that's difficult and I've got snappy hands, I might choose to bend down and pop it on the floor. I don't tend to throw it behind me at that point because what I find is they often bounce back. But what I do tend to do is bend down, pop it on the floor, and then keep walking, although I'll just walk reasonably slow. Because what that means is they're eating their treat, I'm advancing ahead, and I'm creating that opportunity again for them to reappear. So sometimes the criteria that we set are very sensible, but we need to think about how we're going to create those opportunities ourselves rather than just hoping that the dog's going to land into that opportunity as well. And like I say, I'll be looking at the environment, I'll be looking at the other bits that are going on around it. How close is the dog? How close are we to other things as well? How much have they been working to decide whether or not they're able to do that? If they're not even able to do that, I'm going to need to reduce it all over again and figure out another way to help them with me. But usually that would be how I would go about it. Perfect. Any more questions tucked in there, Lauren?
One has just come through now. So Margaret says, my dog can be aggressive towards other dogs and it can be sudden. When I give rewards to distract, it feels like rewarding her aggression.
Yeah, okay. So ideal world would be we would be in a situation where we'd read our dog well enough to know that they weren't reacting, because obviously gold standard is that the dog doesn't have a reaction. That's what we're always aiming for, isn't it? Because we know when they're reacting, what they're actually doing is they're shouting about how worried they are and how scared they are. And so obviously the dog's in a bit of a dodgy situation. And we would like to be as what's the word I need? I'd like to advocate for them as much as possible and basically create an environment where they don't feel like they have to do that. So, and that works a lot of the time. We're all really good at saying, my dog doesn't like this situation, I'm going to simply avoid it, I'm going to keep this a big distance. Sometimes it happens, like I'll be walking down a street, a dog will come around a corner, flip a neck, it's all a big surprise, and they do have that reaction. The thing to think is, if your dog is going to react, it's going to react. I can, if we're in the situation where it's going to react, I would prefer it that it hadn't got to that place. So I would prefer that I'd kept further away. But if it is really a dog's rounded the corner, they're going to have that knee-jerk reaction. They're going to have that initial response because that's how their brain's wired, right? That's what they're going to do. But that doesn't mean that they can't apply logical thinking after that fact if I help them. So boom, they have that reaction. I'm immediately going to go, whoopsie, uh-oh. I'm going to catch their attention and I'm going to bring them back and I'm going to give them something else to do for sure, because that's me saying to them, actually, instead of that, can you do this? That's really helpful for reducing the amount of reaction that we're seeing. So if I didn't intervene, the reaction might continue on for this length of time. If, however, I do intervene and do something, I'm going to get this to come back down to me. I'm going to reduce that time that their dog is reacting. And what I'm also doing is demonstrating what I would prefer for them to do. So it's hard because in the moment, they're not thinking logically, they're thinking emotionally, they're reacting to something. But once they've had that, they can then think logically. So it's my responsibility to show them what I want them to do afterwards. You cannot reinforce fear. It's not a thing that you can do. Fear is fear. Fear comes because of the way that they feel about the thing that's happening in front of them. You can't say to a dog that's right or that's wrong. Much as like if you're telling me you're scared of spiders, it's not on me to say whether you're right or wrong to be scared of spiders. I can't reinforce that fear. All I can do is support you through the behavioral change process. You will always go, fucking hell, a spider, whenever you see it. But what you do after that is dependent on how I've shown you to behave. So you might go, fucking hell, there's a spider. I'm going to take a step back and sit over here, or I'm going to go to this. And it's the same with our dogs. What do we want them to do afterwards, right? Your criteria needs to be low because you're not able to do a lot of thinking when you're scared. So if really you would like them to turn around and look at you, they're not going to be able to do that initially. What you're going to have to show them to do is just turn around and be somewhere near you. So that would be turning around and throwing treats on the floor. That would be my lowest level criteria. Building up then to higher level criteria, which is you've demonstrated to me, Rachel, bet you 20 quid that if we have a reaction, they can turn around and sniff the treats on the floor. Okay, now you're ready to build on to the next one. My next one might be, can you turn around and take treats from my hand? That might be the next thing that I ask them to do. So I would build up the criteria that way. But my first criteria is get away from that dog and engage somewhere near me to reduce that time. Like I say, hopefully it won't be practiced too much. We do know that dogs can do act first, think about it second. We see this a lot. So Lucy's dog, Lucy's with us tonight, Safi. Safi has big feelings about things and she has big reactions. And what Safi does now is quite commonly something that would have previously set her off and kept her barking, kept her worried and like really on edge for quite a long time. She now goes, ah! And then turns and looks at her mum. And that's through literally repetition of low level criteria of just turn and engage with me, building it up to turning around and looking at me. And so she might have that initial moment, but it's then what she can do after that that's the clever bit and the torch bit and the trained bit, I guess. So a little bit around the houses because it's not necessarily clearly linked to criteria, but hopefully that was helpful. Lauren, I think I saw more pop through there, flashing in front of my face.
Yeah, we're veering away from the topic slightly, but I'll read it out. I'm sure you'll be able to turn it back. So Rachel has said, what sort of things are good to use after a reaction in this situation? I've tried a few things, but find it hard to regain his attention. And also, how long after the bark or reactive behavior should you offer a treat? As I worry he'll associate the treat with the bark, for example.
I'm going to repeat it because it bears repeating. You cannot reinforce fear. You cannot reinforce what that dog does when they are scared so immediately afterwards, because you're not reinforcing the bark. What you're doing is you're giving them an alternative. You finish that now, come and do this. So the moment they bark, I'm straight in there offering them an alternative and demonstrating the alternative for them. Even as they're in the middle of doing it, I'll be saying to them, hey, buddy, this way, come on. And I'll be in there helping them disengage because they can't disengage themselves. They're scared. They need me in there. They need me supporting them. They need that person advocating for them and like guiding them through that process. So please do get in there as they are working. You cannot reinforce that fear reaction and you will not increase it by offering treats. Get in there as soon as it happens. Then what I would do is I would give them something that helps them calm down. We will look at this when we look at the bucket. So when we come to look at the bucket and when we come to look at peak performance and stuff like this, because we'll be looking at what happens after we've done things and how do we get that back and stuff. But essentially, you've just learned you're too close to the thing. So you need to reduce your criteria because your dog is not thinking mode right now. You need really low criteria. You need to get them round and just get them doing a thing that is not that thing over there. Learn for next time, keep them well away from that. You've just learned a little bit of data. And just for then on, once your dog's had a drama moment, they're going to be less steerable. Their brakes are going to be a bit shitty, and you certainly don't want to be going up on those gears. So you might want to perform your test again. You might want to stop and actually do your brakes, steering, and gear test again. And so you know what dog you've got at the end of your lead, because then you can choose your criteria for the rest of your walk based on the dog that you've now got in front of you. Equally, if your dog's performing really well as you're going through, you might choose to just randomly stop and do your brakes, steering, and gear test again, because you might just want to check that they're actually doing better than they were. Some dogs get better as they go through a walk. Some dogs get worse as they go through a walk. So it does worth stopping and redoing that test again. So yeah, so I think we'll probably answer that a little bit better when it comes to buckets and peak performances and stuff like that. But yeah, perfect. Right, I'm going to call it a day there, because it's 27 minutes past, 3 minutes to my little girl comes home. And thank you again for joining me. Thank you for your questions. I always get challenged by those, bit of thinking on the spot at the end of a session, at the end of a long day as well. Thank you very much, team, and I shall see you in the new year. Have a lovely festive period.